There's a certain kind of silence that only exists in homes built on broken promises. It's not the absence of sound. It's the presence of something heavier. Something that hums beneath the walls, between the pauses of conversation, in the way two people breathe in opposite rhythms while lying in the same bed. Please click the subscribe button. That was the silence I lived with for almost 3 years before the day Daniel brought his mistress home. We lived in a small town called Maple Hollow, a quiet patch of land about 40 minutes from Austin, Texas. The kind of place where people smiled in the grocery store but knew every secret behind closed doors. Our house was a 2-story ranch with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a magnolia tree out front that Daniel once planted for me. Back when we still said, "I love you," like it was an instinct, not a duty. Daniel was a contractor. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that carried the smell of cedar and varnish. He'd built half the porches and barns in town. To everyone, he was the picture of a good man. Steady, hard-working, faithful. But they didn't live inside the walls of our home. They didn't see the way his eyes stopped meeting mine after sunset. I used to tell myself that love changes form, that maybe the silence was maturity. Maybe we were simply becoming one of those old couples who communicate through glances, who no longer need words. But deep down I knew better. Love doesn't fade into quiet. It fights to stay alive. It argues, it pleads, it breaks, it heals. What we had wasn't quiet love. It was the sound of something dying. Began small. He started coming home later than usual, muttering about late orders, delays, clients who couldn't make up their minds. Then came the phone calls that ended the moment I walked in the room, the quick flicker of guilt in his eyes, and the faint perfume I didn't own, sweet, expensive, and wrong. One night, I found a lipstick stain on his shirt. Scarlet red. I remember holding the shirt in my hands and staring at that color like it was a crime scene. But instead of rage, I felt something stranger. Emptiness. My fingers trembled, but not from anger. It was as if my body was catching up to a truth my mind had already accepted. That night I made dinner as usual. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. I set the table for 2. When Daniel walked in, I smiled, asked about his day, and he kissed my cheek like a man trying to play normal. I watched him from across the table, how his fork trembled slightly, how he couldn't meet my eyes. I wanted him to confess, to spill it all, to free me from the waiting. But he didn't. He talked about weather, about wood prices, about nothing. And so I let him. People often ask why women like me stay quiet when they suspect betrayal. The truth is, silence is not weakness. It's study. It's observation. I wasn't a fool. I was gathering the pieces of a puzzle that would one day form a clear, cruel picture. Daniel had been my husband for 16 years. We met in college. Me, an English major with dreams of writing novels. Him, a carpenter's apprentice with dreams of building homes across Texas. I loved his simplicity, his laugh, the calluses on his hands. We used to stay up all night in his truck, talking about everything and nothing, our fingers intertwined like we were afraid of the world splitting us apart. But somewhere along the line, life did the splitting. We lost a child once, a miscarriage at 14 weeks. It broke something in me, something I didn't know how to fix. Daniel was strong through it all, at least on the outside, but we never talked about it. We buried it. Just like we buried the tiny box under the magnolia tree. After that I started writing less, smiling less. He started staying out more, laughing less. Sometimes I wonder if that was the beginning of the end. Not another woman, not temptation, but the hollow that grief carved between us. Still I held on. Maybe out of love, maybe out of habit. On a bright Wednesday morning, I saw her for the first time. Her name was Scarlett Monroe, and she worked as an interior designer for a client Daniel was supposedly renovating for. She came to our house to discuss paint samples. That was his excuse. I opened the door and saw her standing there, young, blonde, confident, wearing a summer dress the color of wine and heels too high for a casual visit. She smiled, that rehearsed kind of smile women wear when they know they've crossed a line but want to appear harmless. "Hi," she said, her tone airy. "I'm Scarlett. You must be Mrs. Collins." Mrs. Collins. That name used to sound warm to me. That morning it sounded like a bruise. "Yes," I said, returning the smile. "Come in." She stepped inside, and for a moment I watched the air between her and Daniel. The way his posture shifted. Stiff, guarded, almost reverent. He didn't look at her directly, but his entire body betrayed him. I noticed everything. The quick inhale, the slight tremor of his hand, the faint flush on his neck. They thought they were clever, but silence has made me a master of reading the unsaid. Played my part well. I poured coffee, asked questions about her work, even complimented her taste. Daniel watched me with something close to fear, like he couldn't understand how I could smile at the woman he'd been hiding. When they left, I stood by the window and watched her car disappear down the road. I remember whispering to myself, "So that's her." And for some reason I didn't cry. Instead I laughed. Quietly, bitterly. Because the woman Daniel had risked everything for wasn't extraordinary. She was ordinary. Beautiful, yes, but ordinary. And I realized then. It wasn't about her. It was about him needing to feel something again. Something he'd long stopped finding in me. In the weeks that followed, I began to change in ways even I didn't recognize. I stopped asking questions. I stopped waiting up for him. I started reading again, cooking smaller portions, sleeping diagonally in bed. I didn't snoop through his phone or follow him around town. I simply detached. There's a certain freedom in surrender. When you stop fighting to save what's already gone, you find an eerie peace. Sometimes, he'd come home smelling faintly of her perfume, jasmine and amber. I'd smell it when he kissed me goodnight. And instead of flinching, I'd think, does she know he still touches me with those same hands? I suppose that was my twisted way of holding on to power. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. My entries were raw, reflective, sometimes frightening. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, about the calm before the inevitable storm. And one night I wrote, "If Daniel ever brings her into this house again, I won't scream. I won't fight. I'll do something worse. I'll make them both see me, truly see me, for the first time." That moment came 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon. The magnolia tree outside was blooming, the air smelled of spring, and I was in the kitchen baking apple pie. I remember humming softly to an old country tune playing on the radio when I heard Daniel's truck pull into the driveway. I wiped my hands and looked out the window, and that's when I saw her. Scarlett. Again. Only this time she wasn't here for paint samples or design ideas. She stepped out of the truck with a small overnight bag in her hand. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. Instead, a strange calm washed over me. A kind of clarity that only comes when you've been preparing for war without realizing it. I stayed by the counter, watching them approach the porch. Daniel hesitated before opening the door, his hand frozen on the handle. Then he stepped inside, his eyes meeting mine with that mix of guilt and defiance I'd come to know too well. "Hey, honey," he said, voice unsteady. "We need to talk." Scarlett stood behind him, clutching her bag, eyes darting nervously around the room. Smiled. "Of course," I said softly. "But first, why don't you both sit down? I just made pie." They froze. That was the moment, the one that would haunt them long after. Because they expected screams, accusations, maybe even tears. But instead I gave them hospitality. Calm, composed, unsettling hospitality. I turned back to the oven, my voice steady. "I wasn't expecting company, Daniel. You should have called. Scarlett, would you like some tea?" She swallowed hard, nodding faintly. Daniel's jaw tightened, his Adam's apple bobbing like he was choking on his own guilt. That was the day my silence became their punishment. The air that afternoon was too still for comfort. Even the curtains hung limp, as though afraid to breathe. Daniel stood in the living room like a man awaiting a verdict. Scarlett hovered near the door, her hand still gripping the handle of her overnight bag, her eyes darting to him, then to me, then back again. I could almost feel her pulse from across the room. Quick, shallow, unsure. "Go ahead, sit," I said, motioning toward the couch. You both looked tense. My voice didn't shake. It was frighteningly steady, even to my own ears. Daniel cleared his throat. Mara. Tea first, I interrupted, turning toward the kitchen counter. Conversations like this go better with something warm. He looked like he wanted to protest, but he didn't. Instead, he sank onto the couch, his hands clasped together, knuckles pale. Scarlett hesitated before lowering herself beside him. She placed her bag at her feet like she wasn't sure if she'd need to grab it and run. From the kitchen, I could see them reflected in the glass cabinet door. Two guilty silhouettes sitting beneath the afternoon sun. The picture would have been almost beautiful if it weren't so tragic. The kettle whistled. I poured the boiling water into the teapot and laid out 3 cups, each identical, each carefully arranged on a silver tray Daniel's mother had given us for our 10th anniversary. I remember thinking how poetic that was, using something meant to celebrate fidelity to host infidelity. When I returned to the living room, Daniel tried to meet my gaze, but his eyes faltered halfway. Scarlett, on the other hand, forced a polite smile, the kind you wear when you're waiting for a storm to pass. Thank you, she said softly as I handed her a cup. Sugar? Yes. Yes, please. 2 cubes. She nodded, and I dropped them in one by one, watching them dissolve like tiny pieces of peace melting away. I sat across from them, legs crossed, hands folded neatly on my lap. The smell of cinnamon and apples drifted in from the kitchen. For a moment no one spoke. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence, a metronome counting down the seconds before the inevitable. Finally Daniel exhaled. Mara, there's something I need to tell you. I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Oh, something new. Scarlett's head snapped toward me, eyes wide, and Daniel's face went pale. He swallowed, visibly fighting for words. You knew. I smiled faintly, tilting my head. Daniel, a wife always knows. The question is whether she chooses to admit it. Scarlett shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her cup. Her cheeks flushed pink. I watched her fingers tighten around the porcelain as though she feared it might slip. I didn't mean for this to happen, Daniel said. His voice trembled between guilt and pride. It just did. How romantic, I murmured, lifting my cup. Spontaneous love. The kind that ruins lives without apology. Mara, please don't do this. Do what? I asked calmly. You brought your mistress into our home. I'm merely being a good hostess. Scarlett looked up, her lips parting as if to speak, but I raised a hand to stop her. No need to explain yourself, Scarlett. I'm not blind to how things like this start. Compliment here, a touch there. Maybe a late-night project, a few too many glasses of wine. Before you know it, you're convinced it's love. Her eyes filled with tears and I felt a strange pang, not sympathy but curiosity. Did she really think she loved him? Did she think he loved her? Daniel told me you'd separated, she whispered. That earned a soft, humorless laugh from me. Oh, did he? How convenient. I turned to Daniel. Is that what you told her? He rubbed his temple, eyes fixed on the floor. Mara, please, I was going to explain. You mean confess, I corrected, my tone still gentle. Confessions come after guilt, Daniel. Explanations are just excuses wrapped in cowardice. Scarlett's cup clinked against the saucer. Her hand trembled as she set it down. I didn't know, she murmured. I believe you, I said truthfully. You strike me as the kind of woman who wants to be loved, even if it means borrowing someone else's happiness. Daniel's head jerked up. That's enough. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man I once adored. The man who used to build me bookcases and write my name in sawdust when we were young and foolish. Now, all I saw was a stranger wearing the shell of someone I used to love. Enough, I repeated softly. You brought her into our home, Daniel. Into the house I built beside you. You made me live with your ghost long before you walked in here today. And now you want me to stop because it makes you uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I leaned back, my voice barely above a whisper. You have no idea what discomfort is. After a long silence, I rose from the couch and walked to the window. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed gently, its white petals falling like fragments of forgotten promises. When I spoke again, my tone was almost reflective. You know, I used to imagine what I'd do if you ever cheated on me. Would I scream, break things, throw you out? But now that it's here, it feels different. Smaller somehow. Daniel stood, his voice tight. Mara, I didn't bring her here to hurt you. I brought her because... Because what? I turned to face him. You wanted to prove how brave you are. How honest. No, he swallowed. Because I wanted us all to talk. To end things properly. The word end hung in the air like smoke. Scarlett's eyes darted between us. Fear and confusion tangled in her gaze. So, this is you ending it? I asked, stepping closer. Bringing her here, sitting me down, offering tea like a civilized execution. Mara, tell me, Daniel. Did you plan this? Did you rehearse what you'd say? Honey, meet Scarlett, the woman who reminds me what happiness feels like. Or was this a last-minute stroke of your twisted conscience? He flinched, guilt twisting his features. I sighed, walking past him toward the kitchen. You both must be hungry. Let me get the pie. Scarlett's voice cracked. Please, you don't have to. I insist, I said, forcing a pleasant smile. Hospitality is a dying art, don't you think? When I returned with the pie, the room smelled of cinnamon and tension. I cut 3 slices, placing them neatly on plates. My hands didn't tremble once. Daniel stared at me, his expression unreadable. You're scaring me, Mara. I met his eyes. Good. As we ate, or rather as they tried to, I found myself strangely detached, like an observer watching a scene unfold rather than living it. Scarlett barely touched her fork. Daniel pretended to chew, his jaw tight. I spoke casually, as if hosting a polite afternoon visit. I asked Scarlett where she grew up, Nashville, how long she'd been designing interiors, 3 years. Whether she liked Maple Hollow, she said it was peaceful. I smiled at that. Yes, peaceful. Though peace is often just quiet chaos, isn't it? She didn't answer. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I looked at Daniel then. Do you remember when we first moved here? You said this house would be our forever place. You spent an entire week sanding that porch because you wanted it to shine like a promise. He nodded faintly, his lips pressed tight. Funny thing about promises, I said. They age faster than wood. The clock ticked again. Scarlett wiped a tear and whispered, I'm sorry, Mara. I turned to her gently. You will be. Not because of what you've done, but because of what it will cost you. Loving a man who betrays his wife is like planting a garden in winter. It looks hopeful, but nothing grows. Daniel stood abruptly, his voice raised. That's enough. I came here because I couldn't live a lie anymore. I wanted to face this honestly. I set down my fork. You wanted to ease your conscience, Daniel. There's a difference. He stepped closer, frustration clouding his eyes. You don't get to act superior. You shut me out long before any of this happened. You buried yourself in grief, and I... You what? I whispered. You sought comfort in another woman instead of your wife. He opened his mouth but couldn't finish. I leaned back, folding my arms. I didn't shut you out, Daniel. I was grieving our child. You were grieving your ego. The silence that followed was suffocating. Scarlett's sob broke it, soft and trembling. She stood, grabbing her bag, her voice barely steady. I should go. Daniel reached for her arm, but she pulled away. No, Daniel. You should stay. She looked at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry for everything. I nodded once. Go on, dear. The road gets dark quickly this time of day. When the door closed behind her, the house felt heavier somehow. Daniel stood motionless, staring at the door like a man realizing he'd just watched his own ruin walk away. I began clearing the dishes. The clink of porcelain echoed in the silence. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I didn't expect this. I didn't turn around. What did you expect? He hesitated. I don't know. Anger. Tears. Something. I faced him then, setting the tray down. You mistook silence for weakness, Daniel. That was your first mistake. He looked lost, like a boy caught in a storm he didn't prepare for. What are you going to do? He asked quietly. I smiled faintly. Oh, I'll think of something. But for now, I think we both deserve a good night's sleep. And with that, I walked upstairs, leaving him alone with the remnants of our tea and the ashes of what used to be love. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling neither sorrow nor rage. Just clarity. They had expected a scene. Instead, I gave them reflection. They expected a wounded wife. I became a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is, they never lie. The morning after Scarlett left, the house felt eerily new. It wasn't the kind of new that comes from change or renovation. It was the raw, unsettling kind that follows destruction. The air was different, the light colder. Even the magnolia tree outside seemed to have lost some of its shine. Daniel's truck was still in the driveway. He hadn't left for work. That alone told me more than words ever could. He was avoiding the world. When I came downstairs, he was sitting at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes. His head bowed over a cup of untouched coffee. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and regret. I moved quietly, making my own cup of tea. The floor creaked beneath my bare feet, and that tiny sound made him flinch. Morning, I said softly. He didn't look up. Morning. I sat across from him, studying the man I used to know. His hair was slightly grayer than I remembered. His face more tired. He'd aged 10 years overnight, and I couldn't decide whether I pitied him or not. He finally spoke. She left town. I stirred my tea. Good for her. Mara. I told her the road gets dark quickly this time of day. I interrupted. I suppose she took my advice. His hands clenched around the mug. Do you have to be so cruel? I met his eyes. Cruel. Daniel, you brought your mistress into our home. You made me serve her tea in my kitchen. I'd say I've been nothing but polite. He looked away, ashamed. I made a mistake. No, I said quietly. You made a choice. Mistakes are accidental. Choices have intention. He leaned back, his jaw tightening. I thought you'd yell. I thought you'd throw me out or something. But this silence, it's worse. Good, I said simply. Maybe now you understand the silence you gave me for years. He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the table like he was trying to find his reflection in the wood grain. Days passed. Daniel started sleeping in the guest room, though neither of us said it aloud. His toothbrush disappeared from our bathroom. His clothes from our closet. There were no arguments, no accusations, just the steady, suffocating rhythm of avoidance. We became ghosts haunting the same house. At dinner, he'd sit across from me and try to speak, but I'd cut him off with small talk about the weather or grocery lists. When friends called, I told them Daniel was fine, just tired. When the pastor asked if we'd attend the church retreat together, I smiled and said, we'll see. But the truth was, we were already drifting toward an ending neither of us had the courage to name. One night, I found him in the living room, sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey. The television was off, but the light from the street lamps cast fractured shadows across his face. He looked up when I entered. Couldn't sleep. I sleep fine, I said, taking a seat on the opposite couch. You? He gave a humorless laugh. Not much lately. We sat in silence for a moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Mara, he began carefully, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but... You don't, I said, cutting him off. He swallowed. Still, I need to say this. What happened? With Scarlett. It wasn't love. It was escape, I finished for him. I know. Men always confuse escape with love. His eyes flickered with something, shame, maybe even relief. You're right. I usually am. He set his glass down, running a hand through his hair. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, but I need you to know that I never stopped caring about you. Caring, I repeated. That's a coward's word for love that's run out of courage. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he asked quietly, "Are you planning to leave me?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. No. He looked surprised. No. I met his gaze, my voice steady. Not yet. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in him. He tried harder, made breakfast, cleaned the garage, fixed things around the house that had been broken for months. It was as though he was trying to atone through chores. But I didn't thank him. I let him do it. I watched. One evening, I came home from town to find him repainting the porch. The scent of fresh paint hit me before I even stepped outside. "White again?" I asked from the doorway. He turned, wiping his forehead. "You always liked white." "I did," I said softly. "Until I realized it stains too easily." He didn't respond, but I saw the flicker of guilt cross his face. I walked closer, watching the brush move in his hand. Each stroke seemed to carry the weight of an apology he couldn't voice. "You can repaint it 1,000 times," I said, "but the cracks will always show underneath." He stopped mid-stroke. "You're not talking about the porch, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm not." That night, I found one of his old love letters tucked between the pages of my journal, a letter he'd written to me during our first year of marriage. "You are the quiet I never knew I needed. If I ever forget how lucky I am, remind me gently before I lose myself." I read it twice, then a third time. The handwriting was steady, strong, certain. The man who'd written those words no longer existed. And yet, part of me still wanted to believe he could. That was the cruelty of love. It made hope feel like a form of self-harm. One Sunday morning, Daniel asked if I'd like to go for a drive. It was unexpected. He hadn't suggested something like that in years. I hesitated before agreeing. The road wound through golden fields, the sky a deep blue streaked with white. Country music played softly from the radio, an old tune we used to sing to. For a moment, we almost looked like a normal couple again. Almost. He parked near the lake, the one where he'd proposed 16 years ago. The water shimmered under the sunlight, calm and indifferent. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. "Dangerous habit," I muttered. He smiled faintly. "I want to try again. Counseling if you'll agree. I don't want to lose you." His voice trembled with sincerity, but sincerity wasn't the same as truth. I turned toward the lake. "You already lost me, Daniel. You just haven't felt it yet." He inhaled sharply, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "I'm trying, Mara." "I know," I said quietly. "But sometimes trying isn't enough." We sat in silence for a long while. I watched a heron glide across the surface of the water, its wings graceful and free. For the first time in months, I realized how heavy I'd become, how much of myself I'd buried just to hold on to something that was already gone. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. But I didn't hold on either. In the weeks that followed, he became increasingly restless. I could feel it in the way he moved around the house, always pacing, always looking for something to fix. He tried to talk to me more, but my replies were clipped, measured. He began drinking again. Not heavily, just enough to soften the edges of his regret. And one night, after too many glasses, he said the words I'd been expecting but dreading. "I saw Scarlett today." I looked up from my book, pretending not to care. "Is that so?" She wanted to talk. She said she's sorry. Ah, a woman's apology. Always too late and too tender. He sighed. "She said she misses me. Then you should go to her." His eyes widened. "What?" Closed my book slowly. "Go to her, Daniel. If she makes you happy, then go. He shook his head. I don't want her. Then stop speaking her name in my house, I said coldly. He stared at me, and for the first time I saw fear. Not of me, but of what he'd done to himself. That night, he slept on the couch again. I stood by the stairs, watching him in the dim light. His face looked peaceful in sleep, almost boyish. I wondered if he dreamed of me, or of her. I went back to bed and wrote in my journal. Guilt is a seed. Once planted, it grows quietly in the dark, feeding on silence. And I've become the gardener. A month passed. We no longer spoke about Scarlett. We didn't speak much at all. But something had shifted again, this time in him. He seemed smaller somehow, deflated. The weight of remorse had settled into his bones. One morning, I found him staring at the magnolia tree, tears in his eyes. I planted it for you, he whispered. Do you remember? I do. He nodded slowly. It still blooms, even after storms. Some things do, I said. Others don't. He looked at me then, and for a brief, fragile second, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who believed forever meant something. And that's when I realized my reaction that day. The calm, the composure, the eerie stillness had done more damage than any outburst ever could, because it forced him to live with himself, to face the ruins he created without the distraction of my fury. He'd brought his mistress home expecting a fight. What he got instead was reflection. And reflection can be crueler than vengeance. That night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I closed my journal and whispered into the dark. The house of unsaid things is the loudest place of all. There's a strange peace that follows heartbreak. It doesn't come right away. First comes the anger, then the disbelief, then the numbness, but eventually when the dust settles, peace creeps in. Not because the wound has healed, but because you finally stop touching it. That's where I found myself. Weeks had turned into months since the day Daniel brought Scarlett into our home. The town had moved on, as small towns do, quietly gossiping until something newer distracted them. But inside our house, the silence persisted. Not the heavy kind anymore, but something softer, almost resigned. Daniel and I had settled into a rhythm that wasn't love but wasn't war either. We spoke when necessary, ate together sometimes, and occasionally sat on the porch like old friends sharing the same grief. It was survival disguised as routine. One evening I found him in the attic. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts as he rummaged through an old box. I recognized the box instantly. It was our before box, the one that held photographs, letters, and mementos from the early years of our marriage. When he noticed me standing by the doorway, he looked startled, almost guilty. I didn't mean to make a mess, he said, his voice low. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers along the old wooden chest. You found the box. He nodded, pulling out a photograph, our wedding day. I could barely remember the girl in that picture. My hair flowing in the summer wind, my smile unguarded, my eyes full of dreams. You were beautiful that day, he whispered. I was hopeful, I corrected. There's a difference. He set the photo down and sighed. I wish I could go back. I gave a small, wistful smile. You can't rebuild trust like you rebuild a porch, Daniel. Once it rots, you can't just sand it down and paint over it. He didn't respond, but I could tell the words cut deep. As I turned to leave, he called after me. Do you ever miss it? Us. Pause. Every day. But missing something doesn't mean it belongs to you anymore. Later that night, I sat in bed with one of my old journals. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged, but the words were mine, raw and unfiltered. May 14, 2008. Daniel built me a bookshelf today. Said he wanted to give my stories a home. I told him he already had. We danced barefoot afterward to no music, just laughter. I read that entry over and over until my vision blurred. That woman, the one who wrote those words, was gone. But her ghost lingered in the corners of this house, whispering in the quiet moments, asking me why I stayed. I didn't have an answer. 2 weeks later, Daniel asked if we could visit the lake again. I almost said no, but something in his voice, fragile, uncertain, made me agree. The drive was quiet. The trees had begun to turn gold with early autumn, their leaves catching the last light of day. The world looked peaceful, but peace can be deceiving. We sat on the same bench as before, watching ripples form on the water. "I've been thinking about that night," he said finally. I looked at him, waiting. "When I brought her here," he continued, "I thought I was being brave. I thought honesty would set me free. But I wasn't brave. I was cruel." "Yes," I said simply. He nodded, accepting the truth like a man taking his sentence. "I don't know what I expected from you that day. Maybe forgiveness, maybe fury. But what you gave me," he paused, searching for words. "It was worse than either. Silence can be its own kind of punishment," I said softly. He exhaled. "You wanted me to suffer." "No," I said. "I wanted you to see. To finally look at me and see what you'd done." He stared at the lake for a long time, then said, "I see it now." "Do you?" He nodded. "You were the only person who ever truly knew me. And I broke that." I turned away. "You didn't break it, Daniel. You traded it for excitement, for ego, for a moment that won't last as long as regret will." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying our words away like confessions. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "Locket. My locket. The one he'd given me on our 5th anniversary. The one I thought I'd lost years ago. I found this in the attic," he said, opening it gently. Inside was a tiny photograph. Us laughing, covered in paint from the day we finished building the porch. "You kept it all these years." I took it from him, my fingers brushing against his. "I keep everything," I said quietly. "Even pain." When we returned home, the sky had turned a bruised shade of violet. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, staring out at the magnolia tree. Its leaves had started to fall, carpeting the ground in white petals. Daniel joined me after a while, sitting silently beside me. After a long pause, he said, "Do you ever think about what might have been if we'd had the baby?" I turned to him, surprised. He rarely spoke of it. "Every day," I whispered. "She would have been 12 now." He swallowed hard. "I think losing her broke something in me. I didn't know how to help you, and I hated myself for it. That's not an excuse, but—" His voice cracked. "It's the truth." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. "You could have reached for me, Daniel. Instead, you reached for someone else." He looked down. "I know." For the first time in months, he cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears of guilt, but deep, trembling sobs that came from somewhere buried. I didn't move to comfort him. I just sat there listening. Sometimes pain needs to echo before it fades. In the days that followed, Daniel tried harder. He stopped drinking. He went to work early, came home on time. He even started cooking again, badly but sincerely. He wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with, but he was trying to be the man he should have been. One evening he made dinner. Overcooked steak, burnt potatoes, and wine poured into chipped glasses. He looked nervous as I took my first bite. "It's terrible," I said with a small smile. He laughed softly, relief in his eyes. "I'm out of practice." He nodded. "You were always better at breakfast." For a moment, it almost felt like before the silence, before Scarlet, before everything cracked. But the illusion didn't last. Never does. After dinner, I found myself staring at him across the table, wondering if it was possible to love someone and not want them anymore. He caught my gaze. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking. About us. About endings," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Maybe this isn't an ending. Maybe it's something new." I wanted to believe him. God, I did. But deep down I knew. Some stories don't get rewritten. They just stop mid-sentence. That night, I dreamed of the magnolia tree. In my dream, it was taller than ever, its branches reaching into the clouds. Beneath it, I saw two shadows, mine and Daniel's, standing apart, reaching but never touching. The wind whispered something I couldn't understand, and when I woke, tears were on my cheeks. The next morning Daniel was gone. No note, no goodbye. Just his truck missing from the driveway and the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the air. At first, panic flared, but then came calm. Maybe he needed space. Maybe this was his way of trying to atone. That afternoon the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers was a small envelope, my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a single page. Mara. I don't know where I went wrong exactly. Maybe it was the silence after we lost her, maybe it was me, maybe both. I'm going to my brother's cabin for a while. I need to figure out if I'm the kind of man who deserves to be loved again. You deserve peace, even if it's without me. Daniel. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my journal. Then I walked out to the magnolia tree, stood beneath its branches and whispered, "Find yourself, Daniel. I already have." That night I didn't cry. Instead, I lit a candle by the window and watched the flame flicker against the glass. I realized something profound in that quiet moment. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness is simply the act of letting go, of resentment, of anger, of the version of love that broke you. Daniel had left, and with him went the weight I'd carried for years. For the first time in a long time, the silence in our house didn't feel like punishment. Felt like peace. And yet, beneath that peace, something stirred. A question, a whisper of unfinished business. Because peace, I knew, never comes without a price. The first week after Daniel left was quiet. Eerily quiet, but not unbearable. The house had grown used to silence, but this one was different. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of absence. I found myself talking out loud sometimes. Not to anyone really, just to fill the empty space. I'd say things like, "We're out of milk again," or "You'd hate this weather," as though he were still in the next room. But he wasn't. I filled my days with small things. Painting the kitchen cabinets. Rearranging the furniture. Walking by the lake every morning, even when the chill bit at my cheeks. I told myself I was reclaiming the house. Making it mine again. And slowly I started to believe it. Until the letters began. The first one came 2 weeks after Daniel left. No return address, just my name written neatly in his handwriting. Mara. The mornings here are cold. I've been chopping wood just to keep warm. Sometimes I catch myself listening for your voice in the quiet, and I swear I almost hear it. I don't know if I miss you or the life we had, but I do miss something. Hope you're finding your peace. D. I placed the letter on my dresser, unsure whether to smile or cry. The second letter arrived a few days later. Mara. I saw a doe by the stream this morning. She stood so still, watching me like she knew I didn't belong here. I think I understand her now. You always said nature could sense truth before we could. Maybe that's why the house never felt right anymore. It knew something had died long before we did. Sorry, Daniel. That one broke me. I sat on the porch reading it over and over until the words blurred. He sounded lost, like a man chasing his own shadow. I didn't write back. Couldn't. What would I even say? A month passed. The air grew colder. The first snow arrived early that year, soft and quiet like a secret. I had learned to live with the stillness. I had even begun to enjoy it. But peace, I've learned, is never permanent. It waits until you've started to breathe again, then it tests you. He came back on a Thursday. I was pruning the frostbitten branches near the magnolia tree when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. The sound of his truck had lived in my bones for years. When I turned, he was standing there, tired, thinner, his beard rough and eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He looked older but softer somehow, like the wilderness had stripped him down to something honest. "Hi," he said, voice barely a whisper. I stared at him for a moment before replying. "You found your way back." He nodded. "If you'll let me." I didn't answer. Instead, I turned back to my pruning, snipping quietly. The cold air stung my fingers, but it gave me something to focus on besides the tremor in my chest. After a long silence, he said, I didn't come to make promises. I came to tell you the truth. Which is that I never stopped loving you, he said softly. Even when I stopped deserving to. The pruning shears froze in my hand. Daniel, I said, my voice steady but thin. Love isn't a confession, it's a choice. You chose someone else. He exhaled, pain flickering across his face. I know. And I've lived with that every day since. When I finally looked at him, I didn't see the man who betrayed me. I saw the man who built my bookshelf, who painted the porch, who whispered to my belly the night we lost our baby. And for the first time I felt pity, not anger, not love, just pity. Come inside, I said quietly. It's cold. He followed me in. The house looked different now, lighter, calmer. I'd repainted the walls, changed the curtains, even moved our wedding photo into the drawer. Daniel glanced around slowly, taking it all in. You've been busy. I had to be, I said. He smiled faintly. Looks like home. For me, maybe, I said. I'm not sure what it is for you anymore. We sat at the kitchen table, a familiar distance between us. I poured him coffee, out of habit more than anything. He thanked me quietly. For a while we said nothing. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock above the stove. Finally he said, Scarlett's gone. I looked up. Gone where? Back east. She left before I did. Said she couldn't stand the guilt. I don't blame her. I nodded slowly. Did you love her? He hesitated, eyes dropping to his cup. No, he said at last. I loved the way she looked at me. Like I was still worth something. But it wasn't love, it was survival. And now? Yes. He met my gaze. Now I just want peace. Whatever that means. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. He stayed in the guest room, fixed the broken gutter, chopped wood for the fireplace. We spoke, but cautiously, as though testing fragile glass for cracks. Some evenings, he'd sit on the porch while I read by the window. We didn't talk much, but his presence didn't suffocate me anymore. It was just there. One night he said, I wrote a lot while I was gone. I looked up from my book. Letters. Stories, he said. About us. About what I lost. He pulled a notebook from his jacket and placed it on the table. You can read it if you want. I hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was messy, rushed, like he'd been racing to outrun regret. The first page read, There's a woman who taught me what grace looks like. I broke her heart, and she still didn't raise her voice. Her silence was her mercy, and her mercy was my judgment. I closed the notebook, my throat tight. You're trying to rewrite your guilt, I said quietly. He shook his head. No, I'm trying to understand it. The days turned into weeks, and the tension began to shift into something softer, something uncertain but alive. One afternoon, as snow fell outside, I found him in the living room, fixing the old bookshelf he'd built years ago, the same one from my journal. You kept it, he said, smiling faintly. Of course, I replied. You don't throw away something that once held your stories. He looked at me then, eyes full of something I couldn't name. Do you think we could start over? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over, ran my fingers along the wood and said, You can rebuild anything, Daniel. But it'll never be the same. The cracks don't vanish. They just remind you where the damage was. He nodded, understanding. Then maybe we start with the cracks. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window again, watching the snow pile softly on the magnolia branches. For the first time in months I didn't feel broken, I felt awake. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about learning to live beside the hurt and still choosing to open the door. But something in me resisted the idea of starting over. Love, after all, wasn't a house you could rebuild with better nails. It was a season, and ours had ended. The next morning I told him so. Daniel, I said gently, I'm glad you came back. Truly. But I think we've reached the part where we let each other go for real this time. He stared at me, his face unreadable. You're sure? I'm sure, I said. This time I'm not walking away angry. I'm walking away whole. He nodded slowly, pain flickering across his eyes, but also respect. You always were the stronger one. I smiled faintly. No. I just learned how to live with the silence. He left that afternoon. No tears this time, no promises. Just a quiet hug at the door and a final look that said more than words could. When his truck disappeared down the long dirt road, I went back inside and sat by the window. The magnolia tree was shedding its last few leaves. I whispered to it softly, "We made it." And for the first time in years I meant it. Because peace, I realized, isn't the absence of pain. It's the acceptance that you can live beyond it. And I was finally ready to live. When Daniel drove away that final afternoon, the silence he left behind was different. Cleaner, lighter, almost like air after a thunderstorm. I stood on the porch long after the sound of his truck faded down the dirt road, staring at the place where his tire tracks disappeared into the horizon. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come back. It felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. That night I poured myself a small glass of wine and made dinner. Nothing fancy, just roasted vegetables and chicken, but it tasted better than anything I'd cooked in a long time. Maybe because I cooked it only for me. No expectations. No silent tension across the table. No pretending. It was just me and I liked it. In the weeks that followed I started writing again. Not in the sad, reflective way I had before, but with purpose. My journal became a map of rediscovery. Scraps of thoughts, sketches of the magnolia tree, pieces of poems that came to me in the quiet mornings. One entry read, "Freedom is not the absence of love, but the presence of self. I spent years being someone's anchor, but now I am my own tide." I didn't know what I would do with those words, but they felt like seeds. Then, one chilly morning in February, while browsing the small cafe near the edge of town, I saw a flyer pinned to the bulletin board. Writers wanted. Local voices of Willow Creek Anthology Project. Share your story. Submit essays, poems, or short fiction about life, love, and rebirth. Something in those words tugged at me. Rebirth. I stood there for a long moment, reading the flyer over and over. And then, almost without thinking, I took a photo of it. That night I wrote my first essay. I called it The House with No Sound. It wasn't about Daniel, not directly, but it was about love and loss and the kind of quiet that follows betrayal. About a woman who learns that silence isn't emptiness, but power. When I submitted it, I didn't expect anything. But a month later I got an email. "Dear Mara, we are thrilled to inform you that your essay, The House with No Sound, has been selected for inclusion in our anthology. It was one of the most moving submissions we received. We'd love for you to speak at our launch event next month." I read that email 3 times before I started crying. Not the broken kind of crying, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes your chest ache, but the full kind. The kind that feels like release. The launch event was held at the community center, a renovated barn that smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and wood polish. I wore a dark green dress I hadn't touched since before the affair. Fit differently now. Maybe I fit differently too. When it was my turn to speak, I stood behind the microphone and looked out at the small crowd. People from town. Few familiar faces. Some I didn't know at all. My hands trembled at first, but when I started reading, my voice grew steady. "There's a kind of silence that kills you and a kind that saves you," I began. "When my marriage ended, I thought silence was my punishment. I didn't realize it was my redemption. Because in that quiet, I found myself again. Not the woman who loved him, not the one who forgave him, but the one who survived him." By the time I finished, the room was still. Then, slowly, applause filled the air. Not loud or frenzied, but sincere. Warm in a way that touched something deep inside me. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me. Her eyes were kind, her voice soft. "You spoke what I've been feeling for years," she said. "Thank you for giving words to the silence." I smiled, tears threatening again. "We all have our silences," I said. "Some of us just finally decide to speak." That night when I got home, the house didn't feel too big anymore. Felt mine. I put the anthology on the shelf, the same one Daniel had built all those years ago, and whispered, "Thank you." For a moment I thought of him. Not with pain, not even with anger. Just gratitude. Because without the heartbreak, I wouldn't have written that essay. Without the silence, I wouldn't have found my voice. It's strange how life gives you gifts wrapped in grief. Spring came early that year. The magnolia tree bloomed brighter than I'd ever seen it. Every petal looked like a piece of forgiveness falling to the ground. I started gardening again, turning the small patch by the porch into a riot of colors. Lavender, tulips, daisies. I found peace in the dirt, in watching life grow from something small and stubborn. Sometimes neighbors would stop by. Old Mrs. Callahan brought me cookies and gossip. Young couples came asking for advice about their homes, their marriages. I found myself smiling, laughing, living. And then, one afternoon while buying supplies at the hardware store, I met someone. His name was Luke. He was fixing up his late father's cabin near the lake, and we reached for the same can of paint at the same time. Sounds like something out of a movie, but it happened exactly like that. He smiled, and I noticed the faint crinkles by his eyes, the kind that come from years of laughter. "Guess you win," he said, handing me the paint. "I wasn't racing," I replied. "Then I guess I'll have to slow down," he said with a grin. I laughed, and it felt easy. Not like flirting, not like performing, just real. Over the next few weeks, we crossed paths again. At the farmer's market, at the cafe, once even at the lake. He had an easy way about him, a kind of warmth that didn't demand anything. We talked about books, music, small-town quirks, the way the mountains looked at dusk. He didn't ask about my past, and I didn't volunteer it. We were just two people learning how to exist beside one another. One evening, we walked along the water as the sun dipped below the hills. He stopped suddenly and said, "You talk like someone who's seen pain but still believes in beauty." I looked at him, surprised. "What makes you think that?" "Because you notice everything," he said. "People who haven't suffered don't notice much." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and kept walking. But his words stayed with me. By summer, Luke and I had become friends. Real friends. The kind who could sit in silence and not feel awkward. Sometimes he'd help me in the garden. Other times we'd cook together. He made terrible pasta, but he made me laugh so hard I didn't care. One evening after dinner he said, "You've got this calm around you, Mara. Like you made peace with something most people never do." I looked at him for a long moment. "Peace doesn't mean there's no scar," I said. "It just means it stopped bleeding." He nodded slowly. "That's beautiful." "It's true," I said quietly. It wasn't love, not yet. Maybe not ever, at least not the kind I'd known before. But it was something pure, something kind. And I realized that was enough. I didn't need grand declarations or promises under the stars. I just needed someone who respected my quiet. Someone who didn't flinch at my silences. Because after all I'd lived through, I had learned something sacred. Love is not the fire that burns brightest. It's the warmth that stays when the flames die down. Months passed, and my writing began to flourish. I started teaching a creative writing class at the community center, helping others tell their stories. Each class began the same way, with a small ritual I'd created. "Write your silence," I'd tell them. "Then give it a voice." Watching those students, young and old, pour their pain into words gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. One evening after class I stayed behind, reading one of their pieces, a heartbreaking story about a mother who lost everything but found herself again. I smiled, tracing the last line with my finger. We all have to lose something to find what really matters. Felt like the story of my life. Sometimes when the wind was soft and the magnolia petals danced in the air, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and think about Daniel. Not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Because he had been my breaking and my beginning. And though our story ended, mine hadn't. As autumn returned once more, I stood under the magnolia tree, running my hand along its sturdy trunk. The same tree that had witnessed my heartbreak now stood tall, still blooming, still beautiful. I whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" And I could have sworn in the rustle of the leaves, it whispered back, "You did." That night, I wrote another journal entry. My name is Mara. I am 52 years old, and I am no longer afraid of silence. My husband once brought his mistress home, and I thought it would destroy me. Instead, it stripped me bare and showed me who I was underneath. Now I am whole. Not because someone came back, but because I came home to myself. That night, after Daniel and Scarlett had long gone to their rooms. His room now, not ours. I sat alone in the kitchen with the old clock ticking above the stove. Every tick was a hammer striking some hollow part of me. Yet I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since the day he walked through that door with her beside him. And I think that unsettled him more than any screaming ever could. There's a kind of power in stillness. Kind of madness, too. I poured myself a glass of red wine, the good one I'd kept for our anniversary that never came, and opened my old leather journal. The one Daniel once teased me for keeping, saying I only filled it with too many thoughts for one head. He had no idea that those pages had already saved me once. From heartbreak, from loneliness, from forgetting who I was. Tonight, I would let them save me again. I wrote slowly, carefully, as if documenting a case. He brought her home. The woman with lips painted like sin and a smile rehearsed in mirrors. He said she needed a place to stay. I nodded, as if he had merely asked to borrow a cup of sugar. The walls of this house know better than anyone how quiet revenge brews. Not loud. Not messy. Just patient. My handwriting looked calmer than I felt. Maybe that was the real art of survival, appearing composed while your soul was rearranging itself piece by piece. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the tall oaks, and the old barn door creaked in protest. It reminded me of the early days, before Daniel's eyes began to wander. We'd moved to Willow Creek with nothing but his truck and our dreams. He had calloused hands and a tender heart then. I remember the first time he told me he loved me, under the porch light, when the rain had soaked us both. I believed him without question. Belief is a dangerous thing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the window. Hair undone, eyes too tired to lie. I wondered if Scarlett had ever seen him like that, unfiltered, uncertain, stripped of charm. Men like Daniel always saved their most broken versions for their wives. Mistresses got the sparkle. Wives got the truth. But the truth wasn't what it used to be. Earlier that evening, I caught them in the den. Scarlett's laughter drifted down the hallway, high, sweet, careless. Daniel was trying to sound younger. His voice strained from pretending. I'd walked in with a tray of tea, like a ghost serving the living, and they both froze. She tried to smile, bless her, but the corners of her mouth trembled. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Everything all right?" I asked as if it mattered. "Yes," Daniel had said quickly. His voice a little too sharp. Scarlett nodded. "Oh yes. We were just talking about music." "Music," I repeated. "Well, you'll find plenty of that in this house. Every room has a song, though some you might not want to hear." They didn't understand what I meant, but the silence that followed told me the message landed somewhere between their ribs. After they left the room, I stared at the empty chairs. The ghosts of our old conversations lingered there, the ones about children we never had, the trips we never took, the future that never came. I traced my fingers over the armrest, feeling the indent of years. When did he start slipping away? I thought about the night I'd found a strand of red hair on his coat, months before he brought Scarlett home. I had plucked it out and held it up to the light. Gleamed like a warning. I remember thinking, so this is how it begins. But I said nothing. Silence can be more powerful than accusation. It makes the guilty fill in their own blanks. Now, as I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, I realized I had learned something precious. Forgiveness isn't the opposite of vengeance. Sometimes it's the tool you use to sharpen it. The next morning, I found Scarlett in the garden. She was wearing my robe, white, cotton, and soft from years of use. It was a small thing, but I felt it like a knife twist. She looked up, startled, when she saw me. "Oh, good morning," she said, fumbling with her teacup. "Morning," I replied evenly. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." She smiled, uncertain. "I hope you don't mind. Daniel said I could borrow it. I didn't bring much with me." Of course he had said that. He was generous with what wasn't his. "You wear it well," I said softly, then turned to the roses. "They're blooming late this year. Strange, isn't it? How some things cling to life longer than they should." Her smile faltered. I could almost see her wondering if I was talking about the flowers or her. That day passed in uneasy quiet. Daniel left for work, pretending things were normal, though I could sense the guilt gnawing at him. Scarlett stayed indoors most of the afternoon, reading magazines and trying not to look me in the eye. I cooked dinner as usual. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. His favorite. When I set the table, I placed 3 plates. When Daniel came home, his face drained of color. "You cooked?" he asked. "I did," I said simply. "We're still a family, aren't we?" Scarlett looked like she wanted to disappear. I poured the wine, served the food, and ate quietly. Every fork clink was a reminder of how absurdly polite betrayal can be. After dinner, I walked to the window while they cleared the table. The night outside was endless, black, thick, unforgiving. I whispered to my reflection, "You're doing fine." And for the first time I almost believed it. That night I didn't sleep. I went to my studio, where I used to paint before life became too heavy. The canvases were covered in dust, half finished. I pulled one out, a portrait of Daniel from years ago. His eyes in the painting looked kind, trustworthy. I stared at them for a long time, then dipped my brush into black paint and began again. By dawn his face was gone, and in its place was mine, a woman who remembered everything. By the time the leaves began to turn gold outside our house, the air between the 3 of us had grown so thick you could slice it with a knife. Every word was measured, every glance calculated. Even the house itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable collapse. Daniel no longer whistled when he came home. He walked in cautiously, like a man entering enemy territory. Scarlett had started to flinch at sudden sounds, doors creaking, footsteps behind her, the faint click of the old clock in the hallway. I had done nothing to her, not a thing. But fear doesn't need a reason when it's fed by guilt. I became quieter, but not absent. Cooked their meals. I tended the garden. I greeted them with the same serene smile. Yet beneath that calm I was studying them, how they looked at each other, how their laughter had started to fade. Love cannot survive in borrowed air. One evening, I was in the study sorting old letters when I heard whispers from the living room. Scarlett's voice trembled like dry leaves. "I can't stay here anymore, Daniel." She looks at me like she knows something. "She doesn't know anything," he replied, his voice taut. "You're overthinking." "No," she insisted. "It's not normal. The way she smiles, it's like she's waiting for something to happen." I smiled to myself in the dark. She was right. The next morning I found Scarlett pacing the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes darted nervously when she saw me. "Morning," I said lightly, stepping out with my coffee. "Morning," she mumbled. "You seem restless," I observed. "Not sleeping well." She hesitated. "This place, it's quiet." "Too quiet." She forced a laugh. "Maybe." He nodded. "Quiet can be a mirror. It shows you what you've been hiding from yourself." Scarlett blinked, her throat working. "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," I said gently, then turned to go back inside. "Tea will be ready in 15 minutes. That day, she didn't come down for tea. Or lunch. Or dinner. Daniel ate in silence, his shoulders tense, eyes avoiding mine. He looked older now, weighed down by something he didn't know how to confess. When he finally spoke, it was with a tremor I'd never heard before. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I looked up, feigning confusion. "Doing what?" "This," he snapped, gesturing vaguely. This act. Pretending everything's fine when it's not. She's terrified of you. She should be terrified of herself, I said calmly. You both should. His eyes darkened. You're cruel. Cruel, I repeated, setting my fork down. No, Daniel. Cruelty would have been throwing her out the day she stepped into my house. Cruelty would have been telling your mother, your friends, your boss. But I didn't do any of that. Gave you peace. I gave her comfort. What you're feeling isn't cruelty, it's consequence. He stood up, furious, but couldn't find the words. I think you should leave her alone, he muttered finally. She's not the enemy. No, I said softly, but she's the wound you chose. He left the table, slamming the door behind him. I sat there for a long time, tracing the rim of my glass. The power I felt was unfamiliar. Not joy, not satisfaction, but something quieter, deeper. I was no longer the woman he could lie to. I was something else entirely. That night I heard them arguing upstairs. Scarlett's voice cracked with fear. She's playing with us, Daniel. Can't you see it? Stop it, Scarlett. You're making this worse. I can't live here anymore. I smiled in the darkness of my room. I didn't need to lift a finger. Truth was doing the work for me. Guilt has its own gravity. All I had to do was let it pull them apart. Days passed. Scarlett stopped coming out of her room. Daniel grew quieter, exhausted. The house felt heavy with their unease. I began to move through it like a shadow, saying little, letting my presence remind them that I was still here, still unbroken. One afternoon I placed a letter on Daniel's desk. Handwritten. Daniel, this house remembers everything. The walls have heard your laughter, your promises, your silence. They've also heard her cries when she thought I wasn't listening. I will not destroy you. I will simply let you see yourselves. That will be punishment enough. When he read it, his face went pale. He came to me in the kitchen, trembling. What do you want from me? He asked. Nothing, I said. Not anymore. Then why are you doing this? Because you brought death into this house, Daniel. Not the kind that buries bodies, the kind that kills trust piece by piece. I'm just letting you watch it rot. He stared at me, horrified. You're not the woman I married. No, I said, turning away. You killed her. That night, Scarlett packed her things. I watched her from the window as Daniel tried to stop her. His voice breaking. She shook her head, tears glistening in the porch light. Then she left. The truck's headlights vanished down the road, swallowed by the dark. When Daniel came back inside, he looked hollow. Are you happy now? He asked. I met his gaze, calm and steady. No, I said. But I'm free. He didn't sleep in the house that night. I could hear him pacing outside for hours, haunted by silence. When morning came, I poured myself coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun climb over the trees. The house felt lighter somehow, empty but alive. For the first time in months, I breathed without shaking. Scarlett was gone. Daniel was broken. And I was something new. Something untouchable. But freedom has a price. And mine wasn't fully paid yet. The mornings in Willow Creek had a way of softening even the harshest truths. The mist rolling off the river blurred the edges of the world, as if nature itself was hesitant to fully reveal what lay beneath. But no amount of morning fog could obscure what had become clear between Daniel and me. Everything was about to change. Daniel showed up at my door just as the sun was stretching its first golden fingers across the porch. His eyes were rimmed red, his face pale, like a man who had been wrestling ghosts all night. I opened the door without a word. I need to talk, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the silence felt heavy, an old friend finally confronting us both. He paced, hands gripping the back of a chair as if trying to steady himself. I'm sorry, Mara. For everything. For Scarlett, for the lies, for breaking us. I watched him carefully. This wasn't the man I'd married anymore. It was a man crumbling under the weight of his own mistakes. You broke us, I repeated softly. But more than that, you broke me. He swallowed hard. I know. And I'm ready to do whatever it takes to fix it. A flicker of something passed through me. Hope? Doubt? Maybe both. Fix it? Yes. Daniel, you can't fix what's been shattered. You can only build something new. He nodded, eyes pleading. I want to build that with you. For a long moment I just stared. The years of pain, betrayal, and silence crowded around us like ghosts. Then I took a deep breath and said, "There's something you need to know." He looked up, anxious. "I never stopped loving you," I confessed. "Not in the way you think." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "Love isn't always loud or perfect," I said, stepping closer. "Sometimes love is surviving the worst and still choosing to be whole." His eyes searched mine, desperate for something solid. "I forgave you long ago, Daniel," I continued. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm ready to move on, whether that includes you or not." Tears slipped down his cheeks. "Mara, I don't want to lose you. You lost me the day you brought her home," I said gently. "But I'm still here. Not because of you, but because of me." He reached out, hesitant. I let him take my hand, the touch familiar but different, like holding a broken piece of something beautiful. "We can't erase the past," I whispered. "But maybe we can write a better future." Outside, the morning sun broke through the fog, casting warm light across the worn floorboards. And in that light, I felt the first real glimmer of peace. The morning light spilled gently through the curtains, casting long golden streaks across the worn wooden floors of the house that had witnessed so much. Love, betrayal, heartbreak, and now hope. I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in years. A quiet certainty. I was no longer the woman broken by Daniel's mistakes. I was the woman who had chosen herself. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a new rhythm. My writing flourished, as did my garden. The magnolia tree bloomed with a fierceness I hadn't seen since before Daniel came back, a symbol of resilience in the face of winter's harshness. Luke, the man with the kind eyes and easy smile, had become a steady presence. Not a lover yet, not a replacement, but a friend, the kind of person who could hold space for you without asking for anything in return. One afternoon, as we planted tulip bulbs side by side, he looked at me and said, "You're stronger than you think, Mara." I smiled, dirt under my fingernails and hope in my chest. "So are you." Daniel and I had one last conversation, honest, raw, and full of the kind of grace that only comes after deep pain. We agreed to let go of what was lost without bitterness, to forgive without forgetting. I wished him well, knowing our paths had diverged for good. With that chapter closed, I began to build the life I'd always imagined but was too afraid to pursue. I reopened my small art studio, hosting workshops for women like me, women who had known loss but chose to create beauty anyway. Every brushstroke on canvas was a reminder that pain doesn't define us, our response to it does. One evening, after a day filled with laughter and paint, Luke and I walked to the lake. The sun was setting, turning the sky a fiery orange that mirrored the warmth growing between us. He took my hand, his fingers entwining with mine naturally, easily. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly. "But I'd like to find out with you." I looked into his eyes and saw not a savior or a replacement, but a partner, someone who respected my past and believed in my future. "I'd like that too," I said, squeezing his hand. That night, I sat by the magnolia tree, petals falling like soft confetti around me. The house behind me was alive, with memories, with love, with promise. I whispered to the wind, "Thank you for teaching me how to let go." Because I had learned that freedom wasn't about holding on to what was lost, but about embracing what's yet to come. Click the subscribe button,